We didn't know back in 1859 what those hereditary factors are. But by 1953, this is what we found. They were looking for the hereditary factor because they said the hereditary factor controls the protein. So the belief is this, that the pattern of the protein, the beads, you know, the colors of the beads that I'm showing you here, are built into the patterns of the subunits on the DNA helix, those little things, the rungs of the ladder. And that these DNA codes for this. And the relevance of why DNA would be the hereditary material is because DNA doesn't wear out. DNA doesn't break down. In fact, you can find fossils, like 50,000-year-old fossils, and take DNA out of the fossils and put them in a test tube and make proteins using the DNA as a blueprint, make proteins from an animal that died 50,000 years ago. The point is, the DNA is stable. There are no proteins left from that animal, but the DNA is left behind. So the point is, DNA becomes a hereditary material because DNA has the ability to be stable and not wear itself out, and that's what allows it to be the hereditary material. So the conclusion of science, and this is a conventional view as we're speaking right here, this is what's being taught in schools, and everyone hears the story. It's called the primacy of DNA. And what does it mean? It says, I told you, you are protein. You're protein. Where does your protein come from? Well, it comes from the DNA because that's the blueprint. And the DNA makes a Xerox copy of itself, which is called RNA, and the Xerox copy goes into the cell, and the blueprint, the RNA blueprint, is read and converted into the protein. So the bottom line is this. Here's a simple understanding. If your character is in your protein, where'd your protein come from? It came from the DNA. So therefore, your character is apparently determined by the DNA. So our belief in the primacy of DNA says this. Who you are, what you are, is predetermined in the blueprint, the DNA. So you become a readout of the DNA. So when you read articles like this in Life magazine that says, were you born this way? Now we start to recognize not only is our physical structure apparently determined by our DNA, but so is our behavior, aggression, anxiety, happiness, alcoholism, obesity. All these kinds of things are now attributed to what? Some pattern that you have received. So if you start to feel ill at some point, and then they start to say, well, yeah, you have genes that are affecting you in this. And so the point about it is ultimately, what is the belief system? The belief system is, if I can understand all the genes, and then I could replace any broken genes that you have, and I could replace your health. It's a nice, noble concept and led to the Human Genome Project. But the conclusion of this is what? This paper just occurred, this was only back in May, in Science. It's a mainstream journal, and it's about the nucleus, the cell, and the nucleus is an organelle inside the cell where the DNA is. And I bring this up because it says exactly what the conventional point of view is. It says the nucleus is the command center of the cell. What does it mean, command center of the cell? Well, what we were looking for was the brain of the cell. As I said, every cell has all the same functions that you have. You have organs to carry out your functions. Inside a cell, there are miniature organs, and they're called organelles. And I said, since you have all of your functions are in a cell, then a cell has a nervous system. The nervous system is the command center. The nervous system is now going to be the nucleus of the cell, that dark red structure. For what reason? Because conventional biology said that the nucleus is the command center of the cell. So what does that mean? Well, that's where all the genes are. All the genes are in the nucleus, and since the genes control who you are, then the nucleus, as a repository of all the genes, would represent the source of control. And therefore leads us to the conclusion that the equivalent of the brain is the nucleus. Does that so far make any sense of what I'm talking about? Okay, now listen to this. This is where it all falls apart. Listen to the simple logic question. If I take the brain out of any living organism, there's an immediate and necessary consequence of that action. What is it? Death. And here's the point. You can take the nucleus out of the cell, and the cell doesn't die. The cell can live for 2 or more months without any genes in it at all. It's not sitting there. It's moving around. It's eating. It's growing. It's meeting other cells and communicating with them. It recognizes toxins and avoids toxins. In other words, I did not change the behavior in one way whatsoever by taking out all the genes. What does that mean? Think of the logic of what does the logic mean? Can the genes control, can be the brain of the cell, yes or no? Yeah, well, that's the important part, because this is understanding of enucleation. The process of removing the nucleus is done a lot at higher levels of biology, and those people who do it obviously know that genes aren't controlling the cell, but somewhere along the line, all of you have heard through all the news media, of course, the genes control the cell. So the bottom line is, assumption number 2, genes control biological expression is false. But then that leaves us with the important question. If the genes aren't controlling the cell, what is controlling the cell? And this is where my research led me about in 1985 to understand the relationship that genes have with the cell. And the important part is this. In the literature, especially in mass media, these two words get confused all the time, correlation and causation. Correlation means associated with there's a connection between things. Genes are correlated with your body. That's a fact. Causation is the act or agency that produces an effect. Genes do not cause anything. That's the error. But the problem is this. You read an article, and this is a true story. An article that reveals, for example, that they found a gene correlated with obesity. And then, here's what was interesting about it. They went to a number of expectant parents who were expecting a child, and they said, listen, if we would do amniocentesis and check the cells of your fetus and found that your fetus had this gene associated with obesity, what would you do? 70% of the parents said they would immediately opt for an abortion. And the relevance about that is, I never said the genes caused obesity. They're correlated with obesity. The fact is, if you read the articles, they always start out, a new gene is correlated with cancer. And then about a paragraph down the road, this gene causes cancer. This is an error. Genes do not cause anything. Genes are potential. Whether you activate the genes or not is not at the behest of the gene. So what is it that selects the genes? And the answer is, well, we start off with the first part about this is, what are the genes, what activates the genes? Because if I knew what activated the genes, then I'd be right at the edge of what's controlling the genes. I use this paper because there's a sentence I use straight out of the paper, so I'm not trying to pull any wool over your eyes. This paper, Metaphors in the Role of Genes in Development, explains this. Metaphors means, in this case of science, when a scientist wants to do an experiment, he creates a hypothesis. This is an idea. The experiment is to test the idea. The hypothesis is not a truth, it's just a suggestion. In 1953, when Watson and Crick found the secret of the DNA code, the hypothesis was made that genes control biology. But that was in 1953. That was 50 years ago. And the issue is this. If you keep repeating that over and over again, at some point, you forget that it was a hypothesis. At some point, it becomes a truth. And so we buy the truth that it's in major textbooks everywhere. Genes control, genes control. And the answer is, do genes control? This paper reveals in this sentence by Niehaut the truth. When a gene product is needed, a signal from its environment, not an emergent property of the gene itself, activates expression of that gene. Well, the third line, not an emergent property of the gene itself, means this. Genes are blueprints. A blueprint is not on or off. A blueprint is just data. If you had a blueprint to a house, is there an on and off to your blueprint? No. The blueprint doesn't go on and off, but what goes on and off is who's reading the blueprint. And the point is, genes are blueprints, but they don't determine if they're going to be read or not. And when it says what makes it read, the answer is a signal from its environment. Well, let me explain exactly how genes work. This is a picture of a nucleus of a cell that's isolated. That's where all the chromosomes are. Then there's a broken nucleus from the same preparation, and you can see all the chromosomes are lined up out there. And you can see, for example, the two red ones. And the point about it is this. You get two sets of chromosomes, one from your mother that comes with the egg, and one set of chromosomes from your father that comes with the sperm. So you actually have two complete sets of programs to make a human being in every cell in your body. And the issue about why I'm showing you this slide is because it's a new interesting technique for staining the chromosomes. And the fact is, what am I staining? Well, the belief system is the nucleus contains the DNA, which it does. But here's the point. I'm not staining DNA. I'm staining protein. 50% of the nucleus is protein. But we don't talk about the protein. Why not? Because we're so focused on the DNA. When they do the experiments, what do? They break open the nucleus like this. They isolate the chromosomes. Then they throw away the proteins and study the pure DNA. But the truth is, There is no such thing as pure DNA in a human system. What does it look like in the system? And the answer looks like this. What are the proteins actually looking like? And right here, what you can see is this. The proteins are covering the outside of the DNA like a sleeve.